We've been using JavaScript, we've been looking at JavaScript, and there's much that I've already shown you that I've not gone ahead and explained. And one of the concepts you need to understand is that of a statement. So let's have a look at statements in JavaScript. A statement is part of the script, the program that you might write in JavaScript. So a program can be considered to be a sequence of statements. We can have expression statements. So an expression is a valid set of literals, values, operators, and can itself contain expressions that evaluate to a single value. That value may be a number, a string, or a logical value. So any expression that stands alone as a statement is an expression statement. String message equals hello world. My block equals CRM get block notebox long. All of that straight in there is two examples of expression variables. We can use other types of statements, and this is a very these are things called compound statements. So the purpose of this, a compound statement is something that is where the statements have to be considered together as a logical set. On the right hand side, you notice how we're using braces to group statements together. But look at the left. The set of statements on the left is using an if condition. This is introducing us to the idea of conditionality. So the if condition, you can see here that this is doing a test for equivalence. CRM.mode is equivalent to view. So if the condition, or rather we can imagine the if condition acting as a guard to the following statement. What we're doing here is checking to see if the CRM mode evaluates to be view mode. If it is, then the second line will be processed. If the CRM mode does not evaluate to be in view mode, then the line would be skipped. But notice that there is another line which sets the mode to be edited, and that will always be carried out. So CRM.mode equals edit. But if we look to the code on the right, we use the braces, we're able to say that both statements must be read together. Everything in the compound statement is treated as a single unit of code. So the guard for that is still the if statement, but the braces that follow allow us to say all these are a condition of the if statement's evaluation. Now we can have different arithmetic operators being used. JavaScript offers the use of different forms of operators that do work on data. Arithmetic operators are used to perform arithmetic on numbers, literals or variables. The best way of understanding this, best way of using this is actually to use this, and we'll see these as we go into the class. We also have assignment operators where we're able to put a value into a variable. So this is when we are working with different ways of assigning a value to setting x to be equal to something. And we'll meet some of these different types as we do our work together in the following lessons. And let's see a little bit more about some conditionality and some of the operators. We met this simple if statement a little while ago, and it did introduce us to the idea of conditional behaviour. What we're doing here is checking the value of an object's property, CRM mode, against a value that's contained in a variable, view. So view here is a variable. You notice that it's a variable because it's not in quotes. Hello world is there a string literal being used to set a variable. What we've got here is a check about a comparison. So the comparison operator that I used was the equals sign, and this is called a test for equality. Now we can test not only for equality, but we can also test for inequality. In this example, I'm now checking that the CRM mode does not equal the value of a variable called edit. And there are other logical operators that we can use. There's greater than or equal, less than or equal. There's also exactly equal. That's the three equal signs, and that means that they're the same value and the same data type. We can also consider the use of example workflow conditions. I've pulled this out of the script for a workflow rule, and this is an example of a type of script that is executed within the server. Exactly the sort of thing that we're going to be covering in the next few lessons. Here you can see that I've used a method getContextInfo to grab the value of the current ID of the opportunity in context. Now I've put that into a variable called int record ID, which I've then used to retrieve all of the quotes for that opportunity. I've then used an implicit Boolean test to see if the property of the record object that has been returned actually contains any rows. The end of property stands for end of file. If that's true, then there are no records in the dataset. Now, I didn't have to use else, but I want to set deliberately the alternative value for valid. Valid is a system variable used to control workflow, and we'll meet that later on again in the lessons. Now, if I wanted to take further checks, I could have added nesting of statements. But let's have a look away from this and instead look at strings. We've introduced ourselves to conditionality. We're now looking at a string. A string is a sequence of letters and numbers. So only this is really allowed characters, and this supports Unicode. So notice how we can use double quotes and single quotes. This allows us to nest strings. So string argument there, comp type equals single quotes competitor. Now that actually would be the sort of thing that we would have to do if we're building a where clause that's going to be added into an SQL statement, because SQL only allows strings to be in single quotes. And if we do need to include sets of quotes in a line, then we can use escape to do that. So notice how we've got a left oblique being used, a left slash, and that means it changes the meaning of the following character. So slash apostrophe doesn't end a string. It allows us to use, like we've got it in o'clock, oblique double quotes. The double quote doesn't end the string. Slash allows a single backslash character to be used in path names. So escapes are very useful. But notice how we are concatenating strings together. They're not attempting to carry out the mathematical operation there. So one of the other tricks that we're likely to use when we come on to working with strings is the use of regular expressions. A regular expression is a type of object which describes patterns of characters. This is a very simple, the one I'll show you in a moment is a very simple pattern. Regular expressions can be used using symbols to allow you to establish pattern matching or search and replace functions within the text. This next example uses the first type. There's a couple of ways of defining a regular expression. This is the first type being used here. You can see that I've declared some variables. We can see the value of the case description field, and you can see that this is using the client-side API. So this is all stuff that could be used inside the custom content of a screen. And I've used a regular expression object that was created using the first syntax. Now I've then gone on to use the match method of a string, because it's of a particular type, of object, which is an inbuilt type. We have strings, then have methods that we can use. String.match, passing in the regular expression, allows us to get a value that's been returned. It's either true or false. It either matches or doesn't match. So we've got a Boolean there, and we've got result CRM.message being held. So I've written out using the client-side API. Now, if we've looked then at regular expressions, let's look at arrays. I'm not going to mention arrays in the majority of the work that we do, because we'll be using other types of objects, but they're worth mentioning. The purpose of an array is to contain numbered values, not named values, although bear in mind that objects in JavaScript can also be what's called expando, which means an object can be created and have new properties dynamically created for it and assigned to it. And because these properties are named, they're typically easier for us to use. And much of the work with the record objects inside Sage CRM, that we have objects called record objects, query objects, then we have screen objects and list objects. What we essentially do with those objects is use what's called the expando nature of JavaScript, and we'll be using those mostly. But arrays sometimes crop up within the work that we do. Array values are accessed via this square bracket operator, and arrays are zeroth, which means that the first element of the array is 0. So we would say array test square bracket 0 is equal to 1. That's assigning the first value of the array. Then array test 1 hello world, so that goes in as a string. So we can mix within the array a mix of numbers and strings, and actually it can hold all data types, including further objects and arrays itself. You can therefore define arrays in lots of ways. This is a type of object that you're going to come across very often, and this is a function. Here you can see that I've defined a function, which is what I've done is I've defined a function here, which is a bundled bit of behavior for use in checking the case of strings. So that's why it's an example there, very much of a compound statement defining this function. So these are all checking the case of strings, and that's capitalization of the strings, to see whether they have been correctly formed. And this example assumes that it's for use within a custom content and then be invoked by things like an on-chain script. But in fact, it could also be used, the same type of syntax can be used inside server-side code. And it makes use of the methods and properties of string objects. Let's have a look at something else. Here's another type of statement with a with statement. Now, withs can simplify the code that's been written, where we've got a statement there with the declaration of the myBlock variable, and then with myBlock. Now, myBlock, because it's a way of declaring a variable, and then the get block returns an object. The object that is returned will have a set of properties and methods. This is documented as to what the get block returns, but that is a type of object that comes from the CRM scripting context. So it's provided by the environment that we're in, and is unique to CRM. Now here it allows all of the properties that are being set to assume to belong to the same object. That's the job of the with statement. If we didn't have the with statement, we'd have to write things out in long form by saying myBlock.formAction, myBlock.displayButton, myBlock.buttonTitle. Now, if we are working with a compound statement like this, and this is a compound, we can use compounds in another way. Here, to allow us to create a type of loop. This is a while loop. And what we've got is a bit of conditional behaviour. Now, notice what's going on in here. Notice how we've got int record ID being defined. It's being captured by the get context info method on the company. So get context info is returning a variable into that first return a value into the first variable, int record ID, and then we're using the value of the record ID to find the person record. So we get a person record back, and then we've got the while loop is checking to see whether or not we have got a value in there. So if we're not at the end of the file, so that is a Boolean check, we're then carrying out what's inside the loop. The while loop loops through a block of code for as long as the specified condition is true. And what you have is always within the loop something that will change the condition. So the next record, for example, moves you on within the array, and that could potentially change the property of the end of file variable. In comparison with that is something called the do while. The do while differs because it loops the contents at least once. So the contents of the loop is always carried out at least once. And this example works here because a company is always created with a person. And this is a for loop. This is very useful where we need to cycle through all of the properties of an object looking for a value. We're using here the current user object. The current user object is created both within CRM's internal script and also is created within the browser as well. So this is exactly the sort of thing that you can try out within the browser code and within the server code. Collections. Now, a collection is a way of working with well, it's a specific type of object within JavaScript that defines or holds sets of related data. Within scripting of an ASP page, we run into these types of objects when handling, for example, inbound data that can be submitted as part of the HTTP request. And it's either in the form that is posted into the server, as it is in this case, it's not in the form, in this case it's coming in from the URL, so that query string is the collection, and we have a property to that collection called the count to tell us how many items are in the collection. We can then work through the values contained inside here. You're using a for loop to do that. So this is looking at the query string to get the set of variables and their values. So JavaScript is the language that we use for coding business rules inside Sage CRM. We've only touched the surface of the language, and I hope that I've given you a sense of the breadth of the scripting language that we use and how it's used inside Sage CRM. We've actually discussed most of the concepts of the language, or at least certainly the main things that you need to know to make sense of the script that we're going to be writing in the following lessons. So thank you very much for joining me today.